There are 5 things which I'll highlight as key priorities for sustained global economic growth. For global economic growth, my priorities would be taming inflation. So that's critical and absolutely critical. There's a lot of expectation on what the Fed is going to say from Jackson Hole. All of us are wondering how that is going to come out, because its spillover is also something which we notice. So key priority for economic growth is taming inflation, because persistently high inflation will weaken demand. It's basic economics. I'm not saying anything new. Equally, elevated interest rates for considerable time can come in the way of economic recovery. So the tendency to use interest rates as the only solution for dealing with inflation has its own downside. And most economies do have this problem, because I think, for want of a better word, obsession with using interest rate as the only tool to deal with inflation and not manage the supply side factors will not give a complete solution for inflation. Temporarily it can give, but sooner the supply side issues can creep their ugly heads up. So the task, therefore, for the central banks, and I know I'm treading on an area which people would be curious to know, did she comment on central bank? But task for central bank, therefore, will have to keep, particularly in today's context, is to keep in mind growth and growth-related priorities, even as equally looking at controlling inflation. The fiscal deficit needs also to be restrained. Otherwise, inflation is not going to be wholesomely defeated or brought under control. The second of the priorities I'd like to put before you is increasing the emphasis on investments to spur growth. That's a sure shot route to achieving growth, sustained growth, and therefore investment in physical assets needs to be substantially raised, driven by the public sector if it is possible, and complemented by private sector. So the public sector may also have to take the lead until the private sector steps in. That's a story which is happening in India, and you see unrelentingly Government of India looking focused for increased public expenditure. But I can see that it is also now attracting private sector to come in and invest. To have a large multiplier impact on recovery and growth, therefore, investments is the best answer. The labor force participation and also improving on productivity simultaneously with increasing investments are two essentials to go with it, and labor force participation rates will have to therefore increase, for which enabling policies will have to be made. Post-pandemic, only a few countries will have the fiscal room to increase public expenditure on capital, yet it has got to be increased. There is no way of looking at constraints and saying I can't have expenditure from public for capital increase. The third of the important factor is raising investments, even as I say, for public expenditure, for investments, for infrastructure. I would say focusing on investments in public health and education is a very key priority for sustained growth. So globally, I think the focus should be on health and education. It is not as if only India, because it's part of the emerging market world, it has to spend on health and education. Health systems are collapsing even in developed countries, and unless money goes into that, we will have a health crisis, And it's no good to differentiate between developed countries and developing countries. Health is got to be kept up always in a very robust and dynamic fashion. Skilling also is important, and that's why I group it under education and health as two important public expenditure items. The fourth one, which I would say as very key to sustaining growth, is climate change finance. I know the B20, I know the climate related groups, and also others are talking about climate financing. We've started with a sense of pessimism only because the 100 billion has never come on the table, but there are always the other side which says we didn't know what this 100 billion is going to go for. It has never been defined. There are legitimate arguments being put forward saying that is why the 100 billion has never come on the table. But the fact remains that few countries, and I'm happy to say India is one among them, have funded their own commitments given in Paris and fulfilled their nationally determined commitments with their own resources. Not very many countries are going to be lucky to do that. And for India too, the transition period is going to be a challenge if we have to fund it all on our own resources. So financing climate change is a key factor for sustaining global economic recovery. Now, this money is one thing when we say we need the money for transition as well, but we need the money for technology as well. We need the money for transition, we need the money for technology as well. And then, if both these are made available, very many countries which are in no position to, fund their own climate commitments can also give us a positive result. But climate is such a matter that no country on its own fulfilling the goals will suffice. It has to be global action. No individual country can sufficiently do enough for the global shortcomings. So it has to be everybody on their own, equally, everybody contributing for the whole. The fifth point, which I think is very important towards sustaining global economic recovery, is diversification of supply chains. The world in the next 50, 60 years cannot afford one more jolt in the supply chains